All the houses in George's small neighborhood were declared run down and unsafe. All the residents decided to resettle in new buildings. They closed all the businesses that employed residents. Everything became meaningless. The neighborhood was deemed unnecessary. First, one house was empty. Then another was moved out. And then it came to the house George lived in. His house was the last one to go. George and the other tenants were given their keys to their new apartments and 1 week to move out. It was a joy for many tenants. But George did not like the move. The new neighborhood was noisy, and there was construction everywhere. The old yard had been familiar to George since childhood, but he had no way out. George packed up, but stayed in his old apartment for a while longer. It was convenient for him to get to work from it. He was surprised at the neighbors who grabbed their things and ran out of there. George had the feeling that this land meant nothing to them. He watched wistfully as his entryway became more and more empty each day. By the end of the week, there were no more burning windows in the house, only occasional people coming in to pick up their leftovers. George was left alone in the house. One day, George was returning to his apartment after work. He saw a broken flower pot on the landing. Earth was scattered on the steps. George knew there was no one else to clean the entryway. He went into the apartment, boiled a kettle, and made himself some dumplings. The house still had electricity and gas at the time. George fell asleep alone in an empty house and neighborhood. George wasn't scared. He thought being among people was much more dangerous. At night, George was awakened by a noise. He heard stomping in the apartment upstairs. George knew there was another family that lived in that apartment, but she had been one of the first to move out. He didn't understand why they could have forgotten. They'd come to get it at 3 a.m. George didn't fantasize and wind himself up. He pushed the mystical and scary thoughts away. George turned on his other side and fell asleep. The next day, George was coming home after work and saw something unimaginable in the window above his apartment. It looked hunched over. Its head was hunched over its shoulders. Its figure was dark, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. George got a thrill of excitement inside. It didn't look realistic. He chalked what he saw up to the reflection of the sunset rays. George decided to speed up his step to get a closer look at whoever was standing there. As George got closer, the shadow from the window disappeared. Near the entryway, George met an elderly neighbor. She was dragging a large bag of her latest junk. George and the neighbor exchanged greetings, the neighbor finding out that he was staying here for the time being and advising him to move out quickly. She spoke of something evil and had already seen someone in the house. George paid no attention to what she said. The older woman took her bag and left. George reflected that Granny was superstitious and nasty. She had been like that all her life, and he had heard nothing good from her. George had a lot of bad neighbors and was glad he had a moment's respite from them. That night, George heard nothing in the apartment above him and got a good night's sleep. He felt at ease, but his peace of mind did not last long. The next day, George was coming home, and he saw the same creature in the window of another apartment. Its eyes glowed with lights, and it looked like a watchdog. As George crossed the yard, the creature flashed its eyes and disappeared. George decided not to look into this apartment. He went to look in the apartment above, where he had seen the creature the last time. The door was open. The apartment was empty, and the walls were bare. George saw strange marks on the walls in the living room. They looked like dirty handprints, but were much more significant than people's. Each print was unique. George had an idea that a creature had moved into the house. It was marking the apartments it had visited. George decided that he had to get out of that house. He went to his apartment and thought about what to take with him. George was very nervous and in a hurry. He wondered how it all looked from the outside and why he was such a coward. George pondered that if it was true and a creature from another world had taken up residence in the house, it didn't have to be evil. Why would it attack George for no reason? He was looking for an excuse to stay one more night in the apartment. The monster didn't scare George as much as his move to a new place. George decided not to go anywhere that night and postponed the action until the next time. He locked the door, ate what he had, and went to bed. George liked the familiar surroundings, and he lay down and remembered his life in this apartment. His memory flashed back to his childhood and how much had happened then. There were a lot of good things, but there were also bad things. George remembered his friend who had disappeared one day unexpectedly. They had been looking for him for a long time, but the boy had never been found. Several children and adults had gone missing in the area over the years. Everyone at the time thought there was a maniac loose in our neighborhood. Everyone was frightened by what was happening. The police investigation went nowhere. People were never found, nor was the maniac caught. George confronted the past with the present. He had troubling thoughts and didn't like the logical chain he had constructed. Maybe the creature had always lived here. It was hiding very well. And when everyone left, it stopped hiding because it was pointless. George regretted staying in the apartment overnight. George was doused in sweat when he heard a creaking noise in the kitchen. Someone had broken into his kitchen, and George could listen to his footsteps ideally. He wanted to fall through the mattress. The door slowly opened, and George stared at it fixedly. He wasn't breathing or blinking. The creature's eyes glowed like little light bulbs. It was tall and bent over to walk through the door. Its arms were long. They reached almost to the floor. Terror gripped George's body. He had never been so scared. He was very sorry to be alone in an empty neighborhood. George mentally prayed that the creature would not notice him. Turning toward the wall, the beast rested its enormous forefinger against it. Its long fingers resembled tree branches. Every touch on the wall left a black imprint. He appeared to have a perfect ear. George moved casually, and the creature turned toward him. Two small lights stared at George. The beast took a step toward the bed and stopped over George. It looked like a long pole. The creature's head was tilted sideways, its shoulders twitching. George gasped in fear. The beast stood staring at him. It took no action. The appearance of human voices outside distracted the creature. It approached the window and peered curiously behind the curtain. George flashed the thought that the monster was watching everyone who came to the house. It had followed George before, too. The creature dashed sharply toward the door and disappeared into the darkness. George took a breath of air, but his heart continued to beat frantically. George got out of bed, looked out the window, and saw several young guys with alcohol in their hands. They were laughing all over the neighborhood. Most likely, the guys were on the lookout for a place to drink alcohol comfortably, and they knew this house was empty. Under normal circumstances, George would have hated them for breaking the night's silence. But at this moment, George was very grateful to them for saving his life. George dressed quickly. He decided not to take his things. He wanted to get away from this house as soon as possible. When George went out the doorway, the guys were already downstairs. He could hear their voices and the clinking of bottles. They were looking for an empty apartment and went into the apartment below me. The guys closed the door behind them. George went downstairs and was dumbfounded by what he saw. The creature was standing near the door where the company was. It was staring at George, and he froze like a pillar. George wasn't going to stop him. The creature stood there, looked at George, and then made its way into the apartment. George needed to hurry, but he couldn't bring himself to go lower. He heard the cheerful laughter replaced by the terrified screams of the boys. He could listen to running and the clinking of broken bottles. Their riots were short-lived. The voices fell silent, one by one. The door opened, and a monster came out of the apartment with its back to me. It was dragging someone by the legs. The creature looked at George. At that moment, his fear grew even more significant. However, George sensed that there was no aggression toward him. George's presence did not bother him. The monster dragged his body down and left a trail of blood behind him. George stood still as if bewitched. The beast returned several times until it pulled all the boys out of the apartment. But George's opinion was wrong, that the monster showed no aggression in his direction. The next turn was his. He never understood why he didn't run away while the monster was doing its nasty business. But it was too late for George. As the beast approached George, he sprinted up the stairs. On the top floor, George hit a dead end. The attic door was locked. The monster took its time and slowly climbed the stairs. It was as if he knew George had nowhere to go. George's whole life flashed before his eyes in an instant. For some reason, the creature did not hurt George. It put him on its massive shoulder and carried him slowly down the stairs. George didn't understand what was happening. That made him all the more afraid. The creature went down into the basement. The basement was pitch black. Only its eyes shone in the darkness. It threw George to the floor and left, locking the door behind it. The basement had a peculiar smell. George realized it reeked cadaveric poison. George didn't have to sit in the dark for long. An hour later, it began to dawn outside. But what George saw when it dawned shocked him. In the corners of the basement lay the corpses of a merry band and several other neighbors George knew. Street lights came into the basement from a tiny and narrow window. George was a skinny guy, and it was no problem for him to climb out into the street through the small crack. To his new apartment, George ran without a second thought. For him, what had happened was like a bad dream. He did not tell this story to anyone, or they would have thought he was crazy. George kept away from the old courtyard and was glad to be alive.